The Chihuahua is often dismissed as a modern fashion statement, a tiny, fragile accessory. But researchers just discovered a genetic truth that flips that story on its head. DNA analysis reveals that this tiny dog isn't a modern invention. It's a living witness to a pre-Columbian past that survived colonization. Today, we're looking at the evidence that shocked the scientific community and proves this breed carries an ancestry far older than we ever imagined. That single finding unsettled a comfortable idea. For generations, the Chihuahua has often been treated as a tiny companion, shaped mainly by recent selection, a fragile ornament of modern taste. But the genetic signal told a different story. It implied continuity, not novelty, inheritance, not invention. The animal sitting beside a person in a city apartment may carry echoes of dogs that moved through Mesoamerican settlements, shared food with families, and survived shifts in power, climate, and culture. The detail that made scientists pause was not only that these sequences were different, it was that they were still recognizable in lineages tied to the American continent. That means the Chihuahua cannot be reduced to size alone. Its body may be compact, but its ancestry reaches into older ground, into a human world where dogs were not decorative accessories, but daily companions woven into survival, ritual, and belonging. A dog so small can still preserve something enormous, a biological memory older than the nations that later claimed the land. By the time the 2011 paper entered the conversation, the question had already changed. It was no longer simply how the Chihuahua became so small. It was how a breed this familiar could carry a genetic thread that survived conquest, replacement, and centuries of reshaping. The answer did not arrive as a neat origin story. It arrived as a trace, a surviving mark in mitochondrial DNA, the kind of evidence that does not shout, but refuses to disappear. And that is what makes the Chihuahua more than a popular pet. It turns the breed into a witness, not a symbol invented in the modern age, but a living descendant of older dogs that once moved through Native American communities before the colonial era redrew the map. The tiny face, the alert ears, the concentrated energy, those visible traits now sit beside a deeper inheritance that cannot be seen at a glance. There is a reason this discovery keeps pulling attention back to the same small body. When a Chihuahua looks up from a blanket or a doorway, it is easy to miss the scale of what it represents. Yet the DNA suggests that the breed is carrying forward an American lineage with roots that predate the arrival of Europeans. In that sense, the Chihuahua is not just surviving history, it is storing it. That is where the unease begins, because once a dog is understood as a remnant of pre-Columbian continuity, every ordinary image of the breed changes. The purse-sized companion becomes something stranger and older, a creature whose present form hides an ancestral record written in cells rather than in stories. And the deeper researchers looked, the harder it became to keep calling this just a modern little dog. The first clue was already enough to disturb the old picture: unique mitochondrial sequences, Native American dogs, a 2011 paper in BMC Ecology and Evolution, a line of descent that did not fit the neat European timeline. From there, the Chihuahua stops being a simple breed history and becomes a question of survival. What else remained hidden in plain sight, and how much of the Americas still lives on in a dog people thought they already knew? Then the story takes a sharper turn. In February 2015, a paper in the Journal of Human Evolution did something deceptively simple. It looked for mitochondrial haplotypes in dogs from the pre-Columbian Americas and asked where those signatures had come from. The title alone carried the weight of the investigation: DNA analysis of ancient dogs of the Americas, identifying possible founding haplotypes and reconstructing population histories. But the meaning was even heavier. The researchers were not just cataloging old bones, they were tracing a family trail. What they found opened a new layer of the Chihuahua's past. Those ancient dogs carried mitochondrial markers that pointed toward an Asian origin for the founding canine lineages of indigenous America. That detail matters because it pulls the discussion away from the familiar image of a tiny modern companion and toward a much older movement of dogs across time and geography. Before the Chihuahua ever appeared in breeding records, before the modern pet world reduced small size to a style choice, there were dogs in the continent already carrying a genetic memory from far beyond the places where they would later be remembered. The tension comes from that distance. A Chihuahua sitting on a sofa can look like the product of recent human preference, the result of selecting smaller and smaller bodies until only the compact form remained. But the 2015 analysis complicates that assumption. It suggests that the story begins not with a fashionable miniature dog, but with ancient populations that were already established in the Americas and that preserved a recognizable genetic thread. In other words, size was never the whole explanation. It was only the visible surface. That is why the finding feels so unsettling to the older idea of the breed. It places the Chihuahua inside a longer continental history, one shaped by migration, survival, and continuity. The little dog seen today is not the starting point of the story. It is the end point of a far older inheritance. And once that is clear, even an ordinary glance at a Chihuahua starts to carry another meaning. The body in front of you is small, yes, but the lineage behind it is not. It is the residue of ancient movement, carried forward until it could survive in plain sight. A detail like that changes how the rest of the evidence must be read. From here on, the question is no longer whether the Chihuahua looks ancient. The question is how much of that ancient continental history remained intact while the world around it changed. That is where the investigation deepens, because a breed can be remade in appearance and still keep its oldest signature hidden in the cells. In 2018, a study in Science drew a hard line through the soft legend of the Americas dogs. The paper, The Evolutionary History of Dogs in the Americas, showed that native dogs across the continent belonged to a monophyletic lineage that traced back to Siberia, arriving with human migrations and then spreading alongside people into new lands. For a while, that result seemed to settle the matter. The dogs were ancient, yes, but they were also part of a much larger movement, carried west by human history rather than appearing as an isolated local miracle. Then came the part that made the evidence feel fragile. After European arrival, Native American dogs nearly vanished, not in a poetic sense, but in a biological one. Their lineages were pushed to the edge by replacement, interbreeding, disease, disruption, and the sweeping changes that followed colonization. What remained was not a clean inheritance, but a damaged one. A few traces persisted, yet the continuity looked broken enough to hide the original pattern from casual view. That is where the Chihuahua becomes more than a small companion animal. It enters the record as one of the few places where the old signal still flickers. The contradiction is sharp. A breed that appears domestic, compact, and modern on the surface is tied to a population history marked by near erasure. The very fact that native dogs almost disappeared after Europeans arrived means the Chihuahua cannot be read as a simple leftover from recent selective breeding. Its significance lies in survival under pressure. The body may be tiny, but the lineage behind it has already passed through a historical collapse that should have erased it altogether. Instead, fragments endured inside communities, breeding practices, and inherited traits that did not announce themselves loudly enough to be noticed at first glance. That is why the usual explanation feels too neat. If the Chihuahua were only a fashionable miniature breed, its genetic story would not need to cross the violent threshold of colonization. But the science study forces a different reading, one in which the dog's ancestry is entangled with disappearance and preservation at the same time. The contradiction is not between old and new, it is between near extinction and persistence. And that tension matters because it changes what investigators must look for next. The question is no longer whether native dog ancestry existed in the Americas. The evidence already says it did. The real problem is how that ancestry stayed alive in enough form to reach the Chihuahua we know now. Somewhere in that gap between collapse and survival, the breed stopped being just a small dog and became a witness. If you want to keep following that witness into the next layer of the evidence, stay with this investigation, because the next revelation is hidden in the places where history was thinned, not erased. In a small genetic marker, the Chihuahua suddenly became less like a modern pet and more like a living continuation. The turning point came in 2023, when a study published in PLOS Genetics reported that the mitochondrial haplotype A2B, already identified in pre-Columbian dogs, still appears in some modern Chihuahuas. That detail matters because it is not a vague similarity in size, shape, or temperament. It is a direct line in maternal DNA, the kind of evidence that survives when stories, names, and even whole populations have been interrupted. The study, titled Ancient Dog Mitogenomes Support the Dual Dispersal of Dogs and Agriculture into South America, does more than place one breed inside a larger history. It narrows the spotlight to central Mexico, where those older dogs once lived beside human communities long before the Chihuahua had a modern identity. In other words, the breed is not just reminiscent of the past. Some of its living members still carry a marker linked to dogs from the pre-Columbian world. That is a much sharper revelation than a general claim of ancestry. It means the trail does not end with broad continental origin stories or distant population movements. It reaches into the bodies of present-day Chihuahuas, where an old haplotype still appears like a quiet signature left intact across centuries of change. And because the signal comes from mitochondrial DNA, it points to a maternal thread that endured through selective breeding, colonial disruption, and the long reshaping of dogs in the Americas. What makes this so compelling is the contrast between scale and survival. A Chihuahua can seem tiny, almost decorative, yet inside that small frame is a record that links back to dogs known before European arrival. The animal on a lap today can still carry a genetic echo from a world in which dogs moved with people, lived among them, and were folded into daily life without the status of a named breed. This is why the Chihuahua resists the easy explanation that it was simply made small by modern preference. Size tells only one part of the story. The genetic record suggests continuity, and continuity is harder to erase than appearance. A breed can be standardized, renamed, and exported, yet a maternal haplotype can keep moving forward quietly, generation after generation, even when the surrounding culture changes completely. For readers who follow this kind of evidence closely, this is the moment to stay with the thread and keep the investigation moving, because the next layer is not just about survival. It is about how survival becomes identity, and how a trait preserved in a few living dogs can force a much older history back into view. In a quiet room, a Chihuahua lifts its head as if it has heard its name carried across centuries. The little dog looks ordinary for a second, almost fragile, and then the record underneath it sharpens. On 7th of August 2025, Smithsonian Magazine described a study showing that the A2B mitochondrial haplotype, known from pre-Columbian dogs, is still present in some modern Chihuahuas. That single detail matters more than its size suggests. It means the thread did not merely survive in theory. It can be found in living animals today. The report, published under the title, "How One Chihuahua Proved to be a Link to the Ancient Dogs That Moved to Latin America," with the spread of agriculture, gave the long debate a second independent push. The earlier line of research had already pointed toward deep continuity. This newer account tightened the picture again, this time through a recognizable genetic marker tied to dogs from central Mexico. The result is not a tidy legend about a tiny pet becoming famous. It is a far less convenient story, a modern companion carrying a biological signature that reaches back into an older human world shaped by movement, planting, settlement, and long familiarity between people and dogs. That is where the meaning begins to change. A Chihuahua is often treated as a product of taste, fashion, and recent breeding, as if its history started when smallness became desirable. But the haplotype tells another story. It does not care about appearance, show rings, or the way a breed is marketed in city apartments. It points to inheritance. It points to a line that passed through generations while villages changed, empires rose, and later crossings tried to blur what had already been established. And there is something especially striking in the way this confirmation arrives. It does not come as a dramatic interruption. It comes as a careful match between present animals and an ancient genetic signature, the kind of match that invites patience rather than spectacle. A breeder holding a tiny Chihuahua in one hand and a family feeding the dog from a bowl in the kitchen would probably never guess that the same animal could preserve a marker associated with dogs that lived beside people in central Mexico long before the modern notion of the breed existed. Yet that is exactly what makes the finding so powerful. It turns a domestic routine into a historical crossing point. The more you stay with it, the clearer the shape becomes. This is not a story about a breed being rescued by chance from obscurity. It is a story about persistence under pressure. The genetic link has been reduced, hidden, and narrowed by centuries of change, but it was never fully erased. The Chihuahua, so often dismissed as merely small, now stands as a living witness to a much older continuity across Latin America, one that survived because families kept living with these dogs, naming them, feeding them, and passing them forward without knowing every answer hidden in their cells. That is why the 2025 Smithsonian report matters so much. It does more than repeat an earlier idea. It strengthens it from a different angle, and in doing so, it opens a wider view of what continuity really looks like. It is not frozen in museums. It sits on laps, runs across tiled floors, curls beside sleeping children, and carries a memory older than the room it occupies. If you stay with that image, the Chihuahua stops being a novelty and becomes something rarer. A small body holding a long inheritance, still visible, still alive, and still asking to be understood with more care than its size ever received. By the time the last layer of evidence came into focus, the Chihuahua had stopped looking like a simple exception and started looking like a survivor with the strongest claim to an older world. On 20th of June 2025, the CNRS released a statement that cut through the confusion with unusual clarity. Even after European dogs arrived in the 16th century, the Chihuahua remains the breed with the most authentic traces of Mesoamerican genetic lineages. That detail matters because it changes the question from how a small dog became popular to why this one small dog kept so much of what others lost. The difference is subtle, but it is decisive. A breed can be fashionable and still forget its beginnings. A lineage can be battered by migration, crossbreeding, and replacement, yet leave a signal behind in the body of an animal that people keep living beside. The Chihuahua carries that signal with a stubbornness few other dogs can match. It is not merely a modern pet with an old story attached. It is the clearest remaining archive of an indigenous canine inheritance that crossed centuries without disappearing completely. That is why the June 2025 CNRS finding lands with such force. It does not erase the earlier work, it sharpens it. The DNA evidence already pointed toward pre-colonial continuity, but now the picture becomes more specific, almost intimate. The Chihuahua is not just part of a broad ancestral pattern spread across the Americas. It is the breed that preserved the pattern most visibly, the one in which the old markers endured in living form while so many other traces thinned out or vanished. In a field where absence often tells the story, this dog offers a rare example of presence, and that presence is carried into ordinary life. In homes, in markets, in the hands of children who learn to hold them gently, Chihuahuas move through the present as if they have never fully agreed to leave the past behind. Their small frame can distract the eye, but the history inside them is larger than their reputation. It includes contact, loss, survival, and a kind of continuity that human communities protected without always naming it. Families did not need genetic vocabulary to keep this animal close. They only needed attachment, routine, and the quiet decision to let a living thread continue. If this kind of history matters to you, stay with it. Because the Chihuahua shows how ancestry can survive in plain sight when people assume it has already been replaced. That is the real surprise here. Not that a small dog endured, but that it endured with so much memory intact. It stands today as a reminder that some histories are carried most faithfully by what looks least imposing, and that the past can remain alive in a body so familiar that most people stop seeing it at all. On a laboratory screen, the Chihuahua does not appear as a novelty. It appears as a trace that had already been waiting in the record for years. In July 2013, a study published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B made a claim that still matters here. Native American dog breeds, including the Chihuahua, showed pre-Columbian origins, and the genetic signal suggested only limited replacement by European dogs. That detail changes the entire frame. The story is not built on a single late discovery. It is built on continuity, tested, revisited, and found again in a different form. The paper's value was not only in what it confirmed, but in what it forced readers to stop assuming. A breed can be popular, tiny, and widely commercialized without being recent in any biological sense. A familiar body can hide an older inheritance. The Chihuahua, seen through that 2013 mtDNA analysis, was not an isolated exception invented by modern taste. It belonged to a broader Native American pattern, one that survived contact, pressure, and the reshaping of dog populations after Europeans arrived. That earlier conclusion matters even more now, because it keeps the latest genetic work from floating free as if it arrived from nowhere. The new findings do not overwrite the old ones. They tighten them. They give the Chihuahua a second layer of proof, one that points in the same direction from a different angle. When one study in 2013 says the ancestry is pre-Columbian, and another later line of evidence finds living markers tied to ancient populations, the result is not repetition. it is accumulation. The animal becomes harder to dismiss, not easier. This is also where the distinction between a breed label and a surviving lineage becomes unavoidable. Names change faster than genomes. Human breeding can compress size, standardize appearance, and turn a living creature into a category people think they understand at a glance. But the genetic record keeps a quieter account. It remembers what the market forgets. It remembers which lineages were carried forward in homes, in villages, in exchange networks, and in the ordinary decisions of people who kept certain dogs close because they belonged to daily life, not to fashion. That is why the 2013 paper remains important. It showed that the Chihuahua's history was already old enough to resist the easy story of recent invention, and once that is clear, the later discoveries become more than a surprise. They become a correction with depth. The dog's ancestry is not a straight line from modern breeding catalogs. It is a layered survival, with pre-Columbian roots, partial replacement, and a residue strong enough to be measured long after the original world that shaped it had changed. A child holding a Chihuahua in a kitchen, a breeder studying a litter, a researcher comparing mitochondrial sequences on a computer screen. Each scene belongs to a different scale, yet they all touch the same continuity. The smallest frame in the room can still carry the longest memory. That is the quiet force of the 2013 finding. It did not simply place the Chihuahua in an older category. It proved that the older category was still alive inside the living dog, waiting for the right evidence to be read again. If this pattern is being traced carefully, it is because the Chihuahua is not a decorative footnote in dog history. It is one of the places where continental memory remained readable after centuries of change. The later studies did not create that reality. They exposed how durable it already was, and once you see that, the next question is no longer whether the Chihuahua has ancient roots. The question is how much of that older world survived in plain sight, carried by an animal people thought they already knew. By the time the 2018 study in Science appeared, the picture had already grown sharper, but also more difficult to flatten into a simple story. Researchers tracing dog history across the Americas found a monophyletic lineage that pointed back to Siberia, carried south with humans, then fractured under the pressure of later history. The paper, The Evolutionary History of Dogs in the Americas, published at https://pubmed cbi.nlm.nih gov299766825, made one point impossible to ignore. The dogs that once lived with native communities across the continent nearly vanished after Europeans arrived. What remained was not a broad field of survivors, but a few stubborn genetic traces scattered inside modern dogs, including the Chihuahua. That matters because the Chihuahua now sits at the intersection of two truths that can coexist without canceling each other. On one side is the deep continental story, where dogs moved with people into the Americas and adapted alongside them for generations. On the other is the brutal thinning that followed contact, when native lineages were pushed to the edge and replaced across much of the landscape. The Chihuahua survives inside that wound. It carries a fragment of an older American dog history, preserved well enough to be read in DNA, even after the larger population collapsed. This is where the discovery becomes more than a breed story. A Chihuahua in a living room, on a doorstep, or curled against a child can look like an ordinary companion, but the genome inside that body still points toward a pre-contact world in the Americas. Not as legend, not as folklore dressed up after the fact, as biological continuity. The evidence does not say every modern Chihuahua is a perfect duplicate of an ancient dog, and it does not close every debate about the earliest arrival of the ancestral population. What it does confirm is more striking. Among living breeds, the Chihuahua keeps one of the clearest surviving signals of that indigenous canine inheritance. That leaves the origin question both illuminated and unfinished. The 2018 science work anchors the wider frame in a Siberian source for American dogs, while the more recent Chihuahua-specific findings show that a real part of that lineage endured in a form close enough to survive into the present. The result is a layered conclusion, not a tidy one. The Chihuahua is ancient in lineage, modern in label, and historically burdened by everything that was lost between those two states. It is a living remainder from a world that European expansion almost erased, and that is why the final picture carries so much weight. The Chihuahua is not simply proof that an old dog line lasted. It is proof that memory can persist inside a body small enough to be overlooked. A family may inherit one without knowing that the animal beside them is also carrying a continental record. A researcher may begin with a breed and end with migration, contact, disappearance, and survival. The transformation is real. The Chihuahua moves from novelty to witness, from pet to evidence, from a familiar face to a last visible thread in an American canine story that still deserves more excavation, more ancient DNA, and more patience. What remains unresolved is not a weakness in the discovery. It is the boundary of what current data can safely say. The deeper past still asks for more archaeological samples, more ancient genomes, and more local histories from places where dogs once lived beside human communities whose own names are now difficult to recover. Until that arrives, the Chihuahua stands at the edge of what is known, holding a fragment of something older than its popular image. In that sense, the animal is both conclusion and invitation, a final living archive of a lineage that nearly disappeared, and a reminder that the Americas still have canine histories waiting to be read more carefully. If you're fascinated by the hidden histories living right beside us, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Did you know your dog might be carrying an ancestral secret? Let's keep the investigation going.